Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. James Swan, 2. Hello there. We've been telling you the story of James Swan, a most remarkable pioneer who came to the Washington coast in 1852 from Boston via the gold fields of California. It is not remarkable that he managed the long trip from the east in the early years, for it was done by many. But he was the first to provide a written record of the activities of the people of this part of the world in which we live. A story as interesting and graphic as modern fiction, and written with the feeling for this new land that could only be grown from a deep-seated understanding of its richness, its natives, and its vast possibilities. James Swan settled on Willapa Harbor at the invitation of Charles Russell, and for 3 years he made his home gathering oysters for shipment to San Francisco, learning the Native American languages, enjoying their way of life, and recording it all in minute detail. In 1857, his book, The Northwest Coast, or 3 Years at Shoalwater Bay, came off the press of Harper Brothers Publishing Company in New York City. The copies of the book are not easily found. They are in libraries throughout America, in old attics, among the relics of that long ago day. They were sold to immigrants heading west to guide them in the knowledge of what to bring, how to reach the west coast of Washington, and what to expect when they came to the Pacific Ocean. Many a covered wagon heading westward contained a copy of this book, and the content was duly noted by the travelers, both for information on the flora and fauna of the new land, and for many suggestions to the travelers on how to keep their trip easy and smooth. There is a copy of this remarkable book in the stacks of the Aberdeen Public Library, but the copy that we found is the property of Stan Giles of Willapa Harbor, a native Willapa resident and the son of a pioneer harbor family. It is among his choicest personal possessions. But more about the book later. This is a chapter in James Swan's story that deals with what is undoubtedly the first 4th of July celebration of any moment in this area. It was the 4th of July, 1853. Swan had just returned to his camp from a trip down the Chinook, where he had witnessed a fishing expedition in action and put 2 friends aboard the steamer that plied between Astoria and San Francisco. He had made the trip over the route from the southwest tip of Shoalwater Bay, as Willapa was called, to the Columbia via a trail used for portage. The route was then down the beach to Chinook, which was the northern landing point for the vessel which came into the mouth of the river. On his return, he found the oystermen of the harbor preparing to celebrate the 4th of July with an all-day clam bake at their tent near the mouth of the Culiquin River. It was several weeks before the 4th, but the boys and the oystermen spoke of themselves, spent the entire period in preparation for the event. Swan was not to bear the brunt of the holiday, but each would furnish his proportionate share of the work and the provisions. The day was ushered in with tremendous bonfire which Swan and one of the oystermen had kindled on Pine Island in Willapa Bay, in which was answered from around the bay with gunshots from a scattered group of white settlers and Native American population. Towards 2 o'clock that day, the settlers began to assemble, and some coming by canoe, some by boat, and a few walking around the beaches of the harbor, which was an easy 100 years ago, as it is today, when the Willapa tide is out. Each of the celebrants brought something. One had a great oyster pie baked in a milk pan, another a boiled ham, a third brought a cold pudding, and others had pies, donuts, and loaves of bread. The product, for there was not a white woman on the harbor, and the Native Americans had not yet adopted the white man's ways of cooking and baking. Swan's neighbor, Russell, the man who had induced him to come to the harbor for a visit, brought with him a long 4th of July oration of his own composing and a half-dozen cans of sardines. When all of the oystermen were assembled, the program was started with the reading of the Declaration of Independence by Mr. St. John, followed by extracts from Webster's oration at Boston on Adams and Jefferson, and then Russell's oration that concluded the talking for the day. The pioneers then got down to the business of eating, and as tables growed with the contributions of food, the Native Americans began to arrive to take advantage of the holiday observance. They came in their highly decorated and skillfully maneuvered canoes and represented the many tribes of the area. The Quinaults, the Quileutes, the Chinook, the Chehalis tribesmen, each even more anxious to see what the white settlers had done, to celebrate and to partake in their food, the type of food to which they were not accustomed. And the most impressive sight and sound were the Native Americans' display of fireworks that followed the banquet. Gunpowder was burnt in every way by the jubilant white settlers, who fired off their muskets and pistols, fused black powder bombs, and generally blasted the great silence of the wilderness with its noisy activities. Then the ceremony was over. The oystermen, to top off the party, they should ignite a gigantic bonfire on top of the adjoining cliff opposite the camp. They were determined that it would be the biggest blaze ever seen on the harbor, or for that matter in Washington Territory. So some 6 or 8 of the men crossed the creek and climbed a steep bluff where they found a hollow cedar stump about 20 feet high. They were able to enter through a hole in its side and found it to be a hollow shell of what had once been a monstrous tree. Swan had with him a short rifle which measured, stock and all, exactly 3 feet. With this, he measured across the hollow stump and found that it had just been 6 rifle lengths, or 18 feet in diameter. It was estimated that the tree, when sound, must have measured with the bark at least 60 feet in circumference. The men went to work gathering fuel, and soon the hollowed stump filled with dry spruce leaves, which lay about the hillside in great quantity, and when filled, they set the whole pile afire, stump and all. Swan recalls it as the biggest bonfire he had ever seen. It burnt all night and all part of the next day, and before the rains came to extinguish it, the fire had caught in the forest, which burned spasmodically for months after. With the exception that there was no cannon salute for the holiday, Swan recalled it as the grandest 4th of July celebration ever known. During his 2nd year on Willapa Harbor, Swan made the trip with some of the tribesmen up the mouth of the Quinault River to visit his friend Kate, the chief of the Quinault tribe, who had frequently called on him at his place. During this trip, he noted the habits and customs of the Quinaults, and was, for many Native Americans, the first white settler they had ever seen. On their return passage, Swan camped the night at the mouth of Grace Harbor. Because of his notes concerning our harbor 100 years back, let's read his paragraph about this, just as they were written. As we approached Grace Harbor, we found that the water grew smooth, and the last found ourselves going through a narrow passage, quite inside and out of reach of the breakers. The sands of the north entrance to Grace Harbor extend out a long way, and at low tide it is very tedious passage around the point. But fortunately, there is a narrow passage I mentioned through the sand which the Native Americans avail themselves of at low water, and which is an excellent and safe place to pass through with canoes. The banks of this passage are full of cohost clams. These are what we call horse clams, and we shortly had a bushel of them. When judging that I had enough to make a feast of fat things, we pushed ahead and arrived in Grace Harbor just around sundown and went ashore. We were soon to build a fire amongst the drift logs on the beach, and the light of the moon brought our things up from the ocean. The other canoes shortly arrived and joined us, when I borrowed a kettle from one of the Native Americans, and we soon had a fine supper cooking for the whole party. There was boiled rice and boiled salmon, boiled and roasted potatoes, roasted salmon, roasted crabs and clams, cold raccoon, dried salmon, sea oil, well oil, to say nothing of the hard bread and puddings made from boiled flour, and tea made from the species of huckleberry leaves. Pepper and salt were no use to this party, but the tea and the Native Americans were sweetened up by the application of some 5 pounds of sugar, which a friend had kindly bestowed on me when we provided provisions. After we had eaten, we amused ourselves by setting one of the Native Americans dancing till he was tired, and when we all went to sleep amongst the logs on the beach, it was truly a magnificent night. Not a cloud was to be seen, and the moon and the stars shone with a peculiar brightness and shimmered on the water. The screaming of gulls and plover made it appear almost like day. I woke at about 3 a.m. in the morning, just as the day began to dawn. The moon was still looking down with her great broad face, and I had not time for reveries or poetic images, for the tide had now nearly reached our sleeping quarters, having come up unusually high. In the few moments more, a wash of sea put out all the remains of our watch fire and woke all hands, and by this time it was beginning to ebb. We were ready to start. So wrote James Swan. The Quinault Indians, who he was traveling with, had only to cross the bay to campground that they maintained in what is now our South Bay area or Bay City. But Swan and his canoe full of tribesmen had to put out to sea through the mouth of Gray's Harbor and head south down the coast for the opening of Willapa Harbor. The next time that James Swan came over to visit Gray's Harbor was at the invitation of Governor Isaac Stevenson, who had called for a meeting of all the Native American chiefs at Plinkington's Claim, at what is now the site of Cosmopolis. And Swan's exact and spicy narrative of what happened at this momentous occasion, when the Native Americans were bound to the government by treaty and the reservations were set up for the return for certain concessions from the general federal authorities, and the finest and most graphic account of this meeting. We will try to find that some evening in our scrapbook, for certainly it is one of the most historic writings still available to what happened on Gray's Harbor nearly a century ago. But tomorrow night we'll find a much different page in our scrapbook, because all attention will be focused on the opening of Aberdeen's new bridge. We will find the story in our scrapbook that has to do with the bridges that have spanned the Wishkah and the men who have built them. The stories of progress written in timber and steel and recorded as a series of milestones in history and a place in which we live and part of our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.